She did not scream. She did not reach for him. She did not even blink when the woman he chose stepped forward and took her place at the table. Amara Whitfield simply sat there, in the middle of Seoul's most exclusive restaurant, surrounded by every powerful person who had ever smiled at her face and whispered behind her back. And she let them all watch. Jae-min Kang thought he was ending her. He thought that one calculated moment of public humiliation would be enough to erase 3 years of her life. He was wrong. And before this night was over, every single person in that room would understand exactly what kind of mistake he had just made. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been made under his name, as everything always was. Amara had not chosen the restaurant, had not selected the menu, had not approved the guest list. She had done what she always did, arrived precisely on time, wearing exactly what the occasion demanded. Her posture, the kind of controlled stillness that came not from confidence alone, but from years of learning how to exist inside someone else's empire without taking up too much space. She wore midnight blue. Not black, because black was too obvious, and Amara Whitfield had never been an obvious woman. The dress was structured at the shoulders, clean at the waist, and it cost more than most people in Seoul would earn in 2 months, though she had stopped thinking about money in those terms a long time ago. Money, by the 3rd year of her marriage to Jae-min Kang, had become something as ordinary and invisible as air. The restaurant sat on the 42nd floor of a building in Gangnam that Jae-min's organization had quietly acquired 18 months ago through a series of shell transactions that Amara had helped him structure, though that was not something anyone at any of these tables would know or care to acknowledge. What they saw when they looked at her was a woman in a beautiful dress arriving beside Korea's most feared man, and that was the extent of their interest. The maitre d' led them through the main floor without stopping. This was expected. Jae-min did not sit among other people. He occupied space at the center of whatever room he entered, and the room reorganized itself accordingly. Amara noticed things that other people did not notice because she had trained herself to over 3 years of navigating his world. She noticed that the private dining room had been set with a long table rather than the intimate configuration they normally used for evenings like this. She noticed that there were 14 chairs and that 9 of them were already occupied when she and Jae-min walked in. She noticed that the 9 people seated were not the usual mix of business associates and trusted lieutenants. They were all men. All of them were connected to the core of the Kang Syndicate's operations, not the legitimate face, not the board members or the legal team, but the people who had been with Jae-min since before any of this had a legitimate face at all. She noticed all of this in the 4 seconds it took them to cross the threshold. She noticed one other thing. There was a woman already seated to the right of Jae-min's empty chair at the head of the table. The woman was young, younger than Amara by at least 7 years, she estimated. Korean, delicate-featured, wearing white. The kind of white that cost as much as Amara's midnight blue, but communicated something entirely different. Youth, replacement, beginning. Amara's heart did not stop. Her hands did not shake. She continued walking at the same pace, and she took the chair that the maitre d' pulled out for her, which was 3 seats down from the head of the table, and she placed her clutch on the white linen, and she looked at the centerpiece, which was a single black rose in a crystal vase. She wondered briefly who had chosen that detail, whether it had been intentional. She decided it probably had been. Jae-min did not look at her. He sat down, accepted the glass of wine a server poured without being asked, and began speaking to the man on his left in a low voice that excluded everyone else in the room by design. This was another of his habits she knew precisely, the way he used proximity and volume as instruments of power. If he spoke quietly to you, you mattered. If he did not speak to you, you were furniture. She had been furniture before. Not often, but often enough that she recognized the texture of it. The dinner began. Courses arrived. Conversation moved around the table in the particular rhythm of men who were performing relaxation while remaining entirely alert. Amara spoke when spoken to, which was 3 times in the first 40 minutes. She asked a question about a business trip she already knew the answer to. She complimented the wine. She laughed at something that was not particularly funny. All the while, she was watching. The woman in white did not speak much either, but her silence was different from Amara's. Her silence was the silence of someone who had been told to sit still and wait, and who was doing exactly that with the patient obedience of a person who believed her moment was coming. She kept her eyes on Jae-min with the focused attention of someone new enough to this world that the novelty had not yet worn into something more complicated. Amara had looked at him like that once. She remembered it. She could not precisely remember when she had stopped. The plates were cleared after the third course. The servers disappeared. This was another signal she caught before anyone spoke, because she had attended enough of his dinners to understand the choreography. When the staff left the room entirely between courses, it meant something was about to be said that required no witnesses except the ones he had selected. Jae-min set down his glass. He did not stand immediately. He let the silence settle over the table until every conversation had died and every person present was looking at him, which was what he wanted, what he had always wanted, the complete and total attention of every room he entered. Then he stood. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he said. His Korean was the particular Korean of someone who had grown up with money, unhurried, precise, with the faint arrogance of a man who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Amara watched his hands. She always watched his hands when he spoke publicly because his hands told her things his face did not. His face was controlled. His hands, when he was managing something complex, had a faint stillness to them that was different from natural stillness. It was the stillness of deliberate suppression. His hands were very still. "There are changes coming to the organization," he continued. "Some of you already know the shape of what I'm describing. Some of you will hear it for the first time tonight. Either way, I want to be direct." He paused. He looked around the table. He did not look at Amara. She understood in that moment, with the complete and total clarity that sometimes comes not as a shock, but as the final piece of a picture you have been assembling for longer than you realized. She understood that this was not a dinner for her. She had not been brought here to be honored or consulted or celebrated. She had been brought here to be displayed. "My personal circumstances are changing," Jae-min said. "The woman who has been beside me for the last 3 years has served her role. Our arrangement was never what the public imagined it to be. It was a business decision, made at a specific time, for specific reasons. Those reasons no longer apply." Not a single person at the table looked at Amara. That was worse than if they had. It meant they had been prepared. It meant they had known. "Suyeon will be taking the position that Amara has held." He said it the way he might describe a restructuring in a quarterly report. "I expect everyone at this table to extend to her the same respect that was extended previously. The transition will be clean and immediate." He sat down. There was a beat of silence, and then, and this was the part that Amara would remember for the rest of her life. The men at the table began to nod. Some of them reached for their glasses. One of them said something quiet to the man beside him that produced a brief exhale of laughter, quickly suppressed. The world continued to turn. Business was business. The woman who had spent 3 years learning every name at this table, every weakness, every agreement and compromise and secret that held these relationships together, she was simply no longer relevant, and the dinner would continue. Amara picked up her wine glass. She drank from it slowly. The woman in white, Suyeon, finally looked at her directly for the first time. Not with cruelty. With something more unnerving than cruelty. She looked at Amara with the mild, detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger on the street, already moving on to the next thought. Amara set the glass down. She looked at the black rose in the center of the table. Then she looked, one by one, at every person sitting at that table. She did not hurry. She moved her gaze with the deliberate patience of a woman cataloging inventory, and she let it rest on each face long enough for the person to feel looked at rather than observed, before she moved to the next. Several of them shifted in their chairs. One older man in a gray suit met her eyes and then looked immediately away. None of them spoke to her. None of them offered anything. Not discomfort, not apology, not even the most basic acknowledgement that something wrong had just been done in their presence. Jae-min had returned to a conversation with the man on his left. Amara reached for her clutch. She stood up. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Her voice was even. Not loud, not soft. The voice of a woman who had decided something, though she would not have been able to name what she had decided yet. Not in words. It was a decision that lived somewhere below language, in the place where 3 years of patience and compromise and invisible labor had been accumulating, waiting for exactly this moment to give it weight. She walked to the door. No one stopped her. No one called her name. The door opened and she stepped through it, and she heard behind her the dinner resume in her absence, as though she had never been there at all. The car was waiting. Her driver, a quiet man named Hyun, who had been assigned to her by the syndicate's household staff 2 years ago, and who had, over those 2 years, become one of the more reliable presences in her life, held the door without speaking. He had worked for these people long enough to read the quality of a silence. She got in. The city moved past the tinted windows. Seoul at night was a particular kind of beautiful, relentless and illuminated, the kind of beauty that did not care whether you were watching it or not. She had loved it when she first came here. She still loved it, though love had become a more complicated word in her vocabulary over the past few years. She did not cry. She had not cried during the dinner, and she did not cry in the car. And she understood, sitting in the back of that vehicle watching the Han River appear and then disappear between buildings, that she was not going to cry tonight. The thing she felt was not grief. It was not humiliation, though the structure of what had just happened was objectively humiliating. What she felt was colder than either of those things and more specific. She felt the particular anger of a person who has been precisely, carefully underestimated. Her phone had been silent for 40 minutes. She looked at it once. No messages from anyone at the table. No message from Jaemin. The absence of contact was itself a message. The transition was already complete in his mind. She was already in the past tense. He had moved on before the dinner plates were cleared, and he expected her to do the same. She put the phone down. She thought about the first time she had met him. 3 years ago, she had been working as a financial consultant for an international firm with offices in Singapore and Seoul. She had been brought in to review a series of cross-border transactions for a client who turned out, on deeper examination, to be less interested in consulting advice than in having someone with her credentials serve as insulation between his organization and certain questions. She had identified this about 3 weeks into the engagement, which was faster than most people would have. She had not left. That was her first compromise. It would not be her last. Jaemin had been direct with her in a way that she had found, at the time, almost refreshing after years of clients who communicated everything through layers of implication and plausible deniability. He told her what his organization was. He told her what he needed. He told her that he was offering her a partnership that had nothing to do with the work she had been hired for and everything to do with what he had identified in her after 3 weeks of watching. An intelligence that he could use, and a discipline that he respected, and an exterior that presented to the legitimate world exactly the image he needed the legitimate world to see. She had been 28. She had been ambitious in the quiet, precise way of someone who had learned early that ambition without strategy was just noise. She had said yes. She had told herself at the time that she understood exactly what she was agreeing to. She had been wrong, not about the broad strokes, those she had read correctly. She had been wrong about the smaller things, the way time changes the terms of an arrangement, the way proximity to someone sustained over years creates obligations that were never written into any agreement. The way you can tell yourself you are simply doing a job while your actual life is quietly becoming something else entirely. She had not planned to love him. She was not certain she had. But she had built something alongside him. Not a marriage in any ordinary sense, but something. And she had given it 3 years of her intelligence and her patience and her skill. And he had used all of it. And tonight he had stood up at a table surrounded by people whose names she had taught him to trust. And he had erased her. The car pulled up to the building where she kept her penthouse. She stepped out. She thanked Hyun. She rode the elevator to the 41st floor. The apartment was exactly as she had left it 4 hours ago. Ordered, beautiful, expensively quiet. She stood in the entrance and she looked at it, and she thought about the fact that this apartment, like everything else she currently occupied, existed within the perimeter of his world. The lease was held through one of his holding companies. The security system was monitored by people who answered to him. Even Hyun, reliable and careful as he was, reported to the syndicate first. She was standing in the middle of a life that had been built around someone who had just publicly announced she was no longer part of his plans. She set her clutch on the table near the door. She took off her shoes. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she looked out at Seoul, and she let herself stand there for a long time, simply breathing. In, out. The city glittered below her without comment. Then she walked to her home office, sat down at her desk, and opened her laptop. Not to write anything. Not yet. She opened it, and she looked at the screen, and she let her mind go to work in the particular way it went to work when she was solving a problem, which was quietly, methodically, without panic, and without sentimentality. She thought about what she knew. She knew the structure of the Kang Syndicate more intimately than any person outside it and most people inside it. She knew where the money moved. She knew which partnerships were genuine and which were held together by fear alone. She knew which of the men at tonight's table believed in Jaemin because they had built something together, and which of them stayed because leaving was dangerous. She knew things about his operation that he had told her himself, because he had, for 3 years, trusted her with information on the assumption that the arrangement made her his ally by necessity. He had trusted her the way a man trusts a tool, with the casual confidence of someone who believes the tool has no will of its own. She thought about the woman in white, Su Yan, young and positioned and already seated in Amara's place before the first course had been served. Amara tried to feel something specifically about her and found that she could not locate anything useful in that direction. The woman was not the problem. She was a variable. The problem was the system that had produced tonight, and the man at the center of it, and the decision that Amara was now, whether she wanted it or not, required to make. She could leave. She could take what she had, which was not nothing, and return to the world she had existed in before this arrangement, and rebuild from there. She had enough contacts. She had enough skill. She had built a career once before, and she could build it again. Or, she kept that word in her mind for a moment without completing the thought. Or, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a message from a number she did not immediately recognize, and then she did. The man in the gray suit who had looked away when she held his gaze. His name was Choi Dae-jung, and he had been one of the Kang Syndicate's longest-standing financial partners, a connection that predated even Amara's involvement, and he had sat at that table tonight and said nothing. The message was 4 words. We should talk. Tomorrow. Amara looked at it for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the desk and returned to the window. Outside, Seoul continued doing what Seoul always did. Moving, breathing, refusing to slow down for anyone's private catastrophe. The city had seen worse than one woman's ruined evening. It would see worse again. But the woman standing at that window was not the same woman who had walked into that restaurant 4 hours ago. Something had shifted in the specific, irreversible way that things shift when a decision has been made below the level of conscious thought, when the mind has already committed to something that the rest of you has not yet caught up to. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. The question was not whether she would respond to Choi Dae-jung's message. The question was how, and toward what end, and who else in that room had already reached the same quiet calculation she was now beginning to form. She had memorized every face at that table, and she was only just beginning to understand that the dinner tonight had not been her ending. It had been the first move in something she had not yet had time to name, and the man who thought he had ended her had no idea that he had just handed her something far more dangerous than loyalty. He had given her a reason. Choi Dae-jung was already seated when Amara arrived. He had chosen a coffee house in Mapo that had no reason to be associated with anyone connected to the Kang Syndicate. A narrow place on a side street with steamed-up windows and the particular exhausted atmosphere of a business that had survived 15 years by being completely unremarkable. He was in the back corner, facing the door, with a cup in front of him that he had not touched. His gray suit from the previous night had been replaced by something darker, more anonymous. He looked like a man who had not slept. Amara sat down across from him without greeting him. A server appeared. She ordered coffee, black. The server left. Dae-jung looked at her for a moment with the careful expression of someone who had prepared what he wanted to say and was now reconsidering whether to say it. I want to be clear about something before you speak, Amara said. Whatever you're about to tell me, I need to know whether you're here because you feel guilty or because you need something. He blinked. Does it matter? It matters completely. If you're here because you feel guilty, this conversation is useless to both of us. Guilt doesn't build anything. If you need something, that's a transaction, and I understand transactions. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Outside, a delivery motorcycle accelerated past the window, and the sound of it cut through the quiet of the coffee house and then was gone. Both, he said finally. If I'm being honest. Then start with what you need. He wrapped both hands around his cup. His knuckles were the knuckles of a man in his late 50s who had worked with his hands before money made that unnecessary. Large, scarred at the joints, the kind of hands that remembered physical labor even when they no longer performed it. Jamin is moving the Eastern Port contracts to a new structure, he said. One that cuts out every partner who was part of the original arrangement. Not renegotiating, removing. The paperwork has already been filed through the Jeju subsidiary. I found out yesterday morning, before the dinner. Amara's coffee arrived. She did not reach for it. He knew you found out, she said. It was not a question. I think so. The dinner was... He stopped. Started again. The dinner was a message, not just to you, to all of us. He was showing us that he could remove someone without consequence, that if he could do it to his own wife in front of witnesses, none of us needed to imagine we were protected by loyalty or history. Amara picked up her coffee. How long has he been planning the port restructure? Based on the filing date, so at least 8 months. She drank. The coffee was too hot, and she drank it anyway and set the cup down carefully. 8 months. She ran the timeline in her mind. 8 months ago, Jae-min had been in the middle of 3 simultaneous negotiations, 2 of which she had helped structure. He had been distracted, or performing distraction, which she now understood were not the same thing. He had been planning a reorganization that would cut his oldest partners out of the most profitable infrastructure he controlled, and he had been doing it while asking her to help him present a unified front to the very people he was preparing to betray. She had helped him do it. That was the part that sat in her chest like something with weight. What do you want from me, Dae-jung? He met her eyes directly for the first time since she had sat down. I want to know if you have documentation. Of what, specifically? Of the original agreements, the ones that predate the corporate restructuring, the ones that exist as private arrangements rather than formal contracts. He paused. The ones he would not want a court to examine. The coffee house produced its sounds around them. The hiss of an espresso machine, a low conversation between 2 women near the front window, rain beginning against the glass with the quiet insistence of rain that intended to continue for a long time. Amara looked at Dae-jung and she thought about what he was actually asking, which was not simply whether she had documents. He was asking whether she was willing to be the person who used them. He was asking whether the woman who had walked out of that restaurant without crying was the same woman who would sit across from him now and agree to become something specific. Not a victim, not a bystander, but a participant in whatever came next. I need 3 days, she said. I can give you 3 days. And I need to know who else at that table is having this conversation. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Park Sung-ho. Possibly Lee Won-sik, but he's more cautious. Sung-ho reached out to me this morning. Park Sung-ho. She placed the name immediately. Heavy-set, early 60s, controlled the syndicate's import logistics in the southern corridor and had built that position over 20 years of work that Jae-min had recently been systematically absorbing into a centralized structure with new management and new loyalties. Sung-ho has more to lose than you do, she said. Yes. Which means he'll move faster than is smart. Dae-jung's jaw tightened. Yes. Tell him to wait. She stood up. She left money on the table for the coffee. 3 days. Don't contact me through anything connected to any of Jaemin's properties. You know what that means. I know what that means. She buttoned her coat. One more thing, Dae-jung said. She waited. Last night, he looked at the table. I should have... Don't, she said, not harshly, with the flat finality of someone setting down a tool they no longer need. 3 days. She walked out into the rain. The first thing she did was change the security access codes on the penthouse. Not all of them. Changing all of them would signal something. She changed the tertiary access, the one used by maintenance and household staff, and she rerouted the building's external camera feeds through a secondary server she had set up 14 months ago for reasons she had told herself at the time were simply professional caution. She had been more prescient than she knew. The second thing she did was contact a woman named Jisoo, who was not a lawyer but knew lawyers the way certain people know doctors. Not because they needed them regularly, but because they moved in a world where having fast access to the right professional was simply a feature of survival. Jisoo ran a private consulting firm in Yeouido that worked adjacent to several of the city's largest financial institutions, and she and Amara had met 3 years ago at an event that Amara had attended on Jaemin's behalf, and they had maintained a careful, occasional friendship built on mutual recognition of intelligence and a shared understanding that neither of them was exactly what the room assumed. She called Jisoo from a phone she bought that morning at a convenience store in Yongsan, paying cash. Jisoo answered on the second ring. "I need a secure meeting," Amara said. "Not at your office." A beat. "How secure?" "Assume someone is looking for the conversation." Another beat, shorter. "Tomorrow morning. The gallery in Insadong, the one with the ceramic installation on the second floor. 10 o'clock. I'll be there." She ended the call, removed the SIM card, and dropped it into a storm drain on the walk back to a taxi stand. The gallery was quiet at 10 on a Wednesday morning, populated by 2 art students sketching in the far corner and an older couple moving slowly through the main floor with the absorbed attention of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Amara found the ceramic installation on the second floor, a series of large, irregular vessels in white and gray arranged on a platform that created natural acoustic privacy if you stood in the correct position among them. Jisoo was already there. She was a small woman with the kind of composed energy that read as calm until you were close enough to see her eyes, which were constantly in motion, cataloging, assessing, measuring the space between things. "You look like you slept 4 hours," Jisoo said. 5, Amar said. "What do you know about the Kang Syndicate's recent corporate filings?" Jisoo's expression did not change significantly, which was its own kind of answer. "I know what's public, and I know some things that are adjacent to public." "Tell me about the Heju subsidiary." A pause. Jisoo turned slightly, as if examining one of the ceramic vessels, and her voice dropped to a register calibrated for the space between them, and no further. "The Jeju filing restructures the port contracts. It's technically legal, barely, because the original agreements were never formalized in a way that gives the displaced partners standing to contest." "Were they meant to be formalized?" "That's a more interesting question." Jisoo looked at her directly. "The people I've spoken to who know the history say the original arrangements were deliberately kept informal, which benefits exactly one person in a restructuring scenario. Jaemin. The informality was the trap. You make agreements in private, you keep them off the books, and when you're ready to consolidate, you have no legal obligation to anyone who trusted a handshake." Amara thought about the 8 months, about every meeting she had attended, every conversation she had witnessed, every document she had helped prepare, and the things she had seen that she had filed away without yet understanding their purpose. "What would change the picture," Amara said, "is if the informal agreements were documented by someone who was present when they were made, not as a party to the agreement, as a witness." Jisoo was very still. That would give the displaced partners standing. It would give them more than standing. Amara turned to look at a ceramic vessel. Tall, asymmetrical, the glaze cracked in deliberate patterns that made it look like something reconstructed after breaking. It would give them a case. "Amara." Jisoo's voice had shifted, not alarmed, serious in a new way. "What you're describing, if Jaemin found out you were building this, I know what he would do." "Do you?" She turned back. "I've spent 3 years inside his world. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I know exactly where the limits of that capability are. He's not invulnerable. He's been performing invulnerability, and there's a difference." She paused. "I need someone who can receive documentation and hold it independently. Someone with no existing connection to the syndicate." Jisoo studied her for a long moment. "I can make an introduction, but I need you to understand what you're setting in motion." "I understand it." "You'll be burning the only life you've had for 3 years. That life was burned the night before last." She said it without heat. "I'm talking about what gets built next." And the message from Jae-min came that afternoon. Not a call. A message, through the building's internal management system, which meant he was using the syndicate's property infrastructure to communicate with her, which meant he still thought of her as something that fell within his administrative reach. The message was brief and framed as a logistical matter. She had 2 weeks to vacate the penthouse, a financial settlement had been prepared by his legal team, and any personal items remaining in the shared office space at the Gangnam headquarters would be boxed and delivered. She read it twice. The phrase that caught her was shared office space. He had called it shared. For 2 years, she had treated that office as operational. She had worked from it more hours per week than he had. She had used it to manage 3 separate streams of organizational activity, and he was now retroactively categorizing it as shared space the way you might describe a guest room. She set the phone down. She thought about the documentation she had. Not in the cloud. She was not that careless. On a drive that lived in a safety deposit box at a bank in Jongno that was registered in the name of a consulting entity she had established in Singapore 2 years ago, well before any of this, because she had always known, somewhere below the level of conscious acknowledgement, that a day might come when she would need to have built something outside the perimeter of his world. The drive contained 3 years of selective documentation, meeting notes, financial flow summaries she had prepared and then kept copies of, because keeping copies was simply how her mind worked. She did not discard information, she archived it. Photographs of documents, records of conversations reduced to summaries precise enough to be useful while remaining deniable as eavesdropping. It was not a complete case, but it was the kind of raw material that, in the hands of the right people, could become one. She called Dae-jung on the burner phone. He answered immediately. "Tell Park Sung-ho he gets his meeting," she said. "But it happens on my timeline, and there are conditions." A pause. "What conditions?" "He shares everything he has on the Jeju filing. Not summaries, everything. Originals or copies where originals aren't available. And he doesn't move independently. Nothing. No legal filing, no contact with any investigative body, no conversation with any journalist, without coming through me first. He won't like that. He doesn't have to like it. He has to agree to it. Or he can spend the next 2 years watching Jae-min dismantle what's left of his operation while he tries to fight it alone with lawyers who will bill him into the ground and accomplish nothing." She paused. "Tell him I said that, those exact words." Dae-jung was quiet for a moment. "You've changed." "I haven't changed," she said. "You just didn't know what I was." She ended the call. Park Sung-ho was not what she had expected, which was itself a useful piece of information about her own assumptions. She had seen him at syndicate events perhaps a dozen times over 3 years, always at the edge of gatherings, always eating too much, always with the slightly rumpled presentation of a man who had made his money through grinding operational competence rather than charisma. She had cataloged him as reliable and limited. She revised that assessment within 10 minutes of sitting across from him. They met at a restaurant in Mapo, different from the coffee house she had used with Dae-jung. Sung-ho arrived 7 minutes late, which she noted, and he sat down with the particular heaviness of a large man who carried the weight of ongoing stress in his body rather than his face. "You're running this," he said before she could speak. Not a question, not a complaint, a calibration. "Yes," she said. "Why should I trust someone who was his wife?" "Because being his wife is the reason I know everything I know." She held his gaze. "And because you don't have better options." He studied her. His breathing was audible. He had the respiratory pattern of a man with blood pressure issues and too many years of bad food and high tension, and the sound of it was oddly grounding in the quiet of the restaurant. He was real in a way that the polished surfaces of Jae-min's world often weren't. He had something to lose that he had actually built with his own hands, and that made him useful. "The Jeju filing," he said. "You know what it actually does? It removes the original partners from the revenue structure while retaining their operational responsibilities. They continue to absorb risk and cost while Jae-min captures the profit through the new entity." He stared at her. "He told you this?" "No. I read the filing and I understand what it means." She reached for her water glass. "He didn't tell me much directly. He didn't need to. He operated in front of me for 3 years on the assumption that I was processing about 30% of what I actually observed." Sung-ho leaned back. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but the recalibration that happens when a person realizes they have been operating with incorrect data. "There are 3 other partners in the same position as me," he said. They don't know yet. Jaemin has been careful about the sequencing. Each one will find out individually, too late to coordinate. I know, which means we move before they find out independently. She set down the glass. I need their names and I need introductions that don't go through Jaemin's network. That's not simple. Nothing about this is simple. The name's Sung-ho. He told her. She did not write them down. She did not need to. She had always had the kind of memory that retained what it needed to retain without effort, as naturally as breathing, and the name settled into her mind with the particular solidity of information that had found its correct place. There's something else, Sung-ho said. His voice had dropped. His hands, which had been flat on the table, curled inward. About why Jaemin moved when he did. The timing of it. Amara went still. He's been in contact with a federal task force, Sung-ho said. Not as a target, as an informant. The restaurant continued around them. A table of office workers laughed at something. The kitchen produced a clatter of something metal. Amara heard all of it from what felt like a significant distance. Since when? She said. 14 months, possibly longer. Sung-ho's eyes were on the table. The restructuring, the dinner, replacing you. None of it is just about consolidating power. He's been building a clean version of himself, documenting that the people he's cutting out were the source of the irregularities, making himself the cooperative witness instead of the primary subject. She thought about the word 14 months. 14 months ago, she had helped him restructure 3 financial instruments that created a clear separation between legitimate holdings and everything else. She had thought it was about liability management, about creating distance between the organization's public face and its operational reality. She had been right about the purpose and completely wrong about who the distance was being created for. He had not been protecting the organization. He had been building a case against the people inside it, and she had helped him do it. The partners you're describing, she said slowly, the ones who don't know yet about the Jeju filing. She looked at Sung-ho. They're not just being cut out of the revenue structure. Sung-ho's jaw was tight. No. They're being positioned as the responsible parties. Yes. And the task force has an agreement with him that requires, what? Testimony? Documentation? Both. And the elimination of anyone who could complicate the narrative. He finally looked up at her. That's what last night was, Amara. He wasn't just replacing you because of the girl. He was removing you because you know too much to leave inside his story as a sympathetic character. You would have been a liability the moment the task force moved to the next phase. She sat with that. The meal she had not ordered. The restaurant she had entered as one kind of person and was now sitting in as something else, something that did not yet have a clean name but was rapidly acquiring one. He had not only betrayed her publicly, he had been engineering her erasure for over a year, and she had been inside the machine helping it run, and the night at the restaurant had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the moment he decided she was finally dispensable enough to discard. The word that had been forming at the end of that thought completed itself somewhere in the back of her mind without ceremony, and Amara sat with it for 3 full seconds before she spoke again. "Where did you get this?" she said. Her voice was level. She needed it to be level. Sung-ho reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. Not an original, a photocopy, the kind made in haste on a machine that needed toner, the text slightly faded at the edges. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her without unfolding it. She unfolded it. It was a partial transcript, formatted in the specific way that internal documentation from a federal investigative body is formatted. Header codes, case reference numbers, date stamps, the particular bureaucratic grammar of official record-keeping. She read it once quickly and then again slowly, the way she read everything that mattered. Her name appeared twice, not as a subject, as a named associate in a section describing the organizational structure of the Kang Syndicate's financial management layer. The language around her name was precise and clinical, and positioned her as a knowing participant in 3 specific financial operations that she had, in fact, participated in, operations she had understood as internal management, and that this document was framing as something considerably more criminal. He had not just been building a clean version of himself, he had been building a dirty version of her. "How long have you had this?" she said. 4 days. And you waited until now. I needed to know what you knew first. He said it without apology. The directness of it was the most honest thing about him. If you were part of his arrangement with the task force, if you knew about it and stayed, then bringing you in was a risk I couldn't take. She folded the document and set it down on the table between them with careful precision, as though placing it in exactly the right spot required attention she could not spare from other things. I wasn't part of it, she said. I believe you. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to understand the difference between what this document says and what I actually did, because that difference is the only thing that matters now. She pulled the document back and put it in her bag. He watched her do it without objecting. Who else has seen this? One other person. Someone I trust. Trust is a word I'm currently reassessing the definition of. Give me a name. He hesitated. Sung Ho. Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in temperature. Give me the name. Lee Won-sik. She breathed in through her nose. Slowly. Lee Won-sik. The cautious one, Daijung had said. The one who might come in or might not, depending on how things moved. She had factored him as a variable, peripheral, someone to bring in later when the shape of things was clearer. The variable had been holding the most dangerous document in this situation for 4 days without telling her. I need to speak to Won-sik today, she said. Not tomorrow, today. I'll arrange it. She stood. Her legs were steady. She made sure of that before she put her full weight on them. Don't use anything with a Kang connection. You know what that means. I know. She picked up her bag and she walked out of the restaurant into air that felt colder than it had when she arrived, though the temperature had not changed. The city moved around her with its usual indifference, and she stood on the pavement for a moment, and she made herself breathe. In, fully, until her lungs pushed back. And then out. All of it. And she did this twice before she started walking. 14 months. The number kept returning, not because it surprised her, but because of what it meant in specific terms. What she had done in those 14 months. What she had helped build. What she had said in rooms full of people, while a case was being constructed around her without her knowledge. She had been a participant in her own framing, and she had done it with complete competence and thoroughness because she had believed she understood the purpose of what she was doing. She had been the most useful person in the room for 3 years, and that usefulness had been the instrument of her destruction. She flagged a taxi and gave an address in Seodaman, and she sat in the back seat, and she did not look at her phone, and she did not think about Jaemin's face, or the dinner, or the woman in white, because none of that was useful now. What was useful was the drive, the document, the 14 months, the names Sung Ho had given her, and the shape of a plan that was restructuring itself in real time as new information rewrote the parameters. She had believed she was building a case. She was actually trying to stay out of prison. The distinction mattered enormously. Lee Won-sik opened the door of his apartment in Seodamun himself, which told her something. He had sent his household staff away, which meant he had been expecting this conversation and had wanted no witnesses to it. He was a lean man, mid-50s, with the particular angular face of someone who had been handsome at 30 and had aged into something more severe and more interesting. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he held them there as he looked at her. One hand on the door frame, not moving to invite her in. Sung Ho called ahead, she said. I know. He stepped back. She walked in. The apartment was the apartment of a man who lived alone and read constantly. Books on every surface in the particular organized disorder of someone who had a system that only they understood. She clocked the exits, the windows, the sight lines. Not because she was afraid, because she had stopped being careless. He did not offer her anything to drink. They stood in his living room among the books, and he crossed his arms, and she faced him. How complete is the task force's case, she said. Against the partners? Or against you? Both. He pulled the glasses off his forehead and turned them in his hands. Against the partners. Sung Ho, Daijung, the others, substantial. Jaemin has been providing documentation for 14 months. Financial records, communication logs, meeting records. Enough that when the task force moves, the case against them is largely pre-built. And against me, he was quiet for a moment, not evasive, measuring. You were named in the organizational assessment as a senior financial architect. The specific term used was architect, not participant, architect. He set the glasses down on a stack of books. That framing was deliberate. It positions you as someone who designed the systems rather than someone who operated within them. The words sat in the air between them. Architect. She had designed systems. That was accurate. She had brought genuine analytical skill to the work she did, and she had been proud of that skill in the complicated way you can be proud of something that exists in morally ambiguous territory. She had told herself the pride was about the craft and not the application. Jaemin had taken that pride and turned it into a charge. "What does the task force want?" she said. "What task forces always want? Testimony, cooperation, someone who can explain the systems from the inside. They already have Jaemin for that. They have Jaemin's version." Won-sik looked at her steadily. His version has a very specific shape. It places the financial architecture in the hands of an external consultant who was brought in specifically to structure those operations. Someone with international credentials and no prior relationship to the syndicate, which made her uniquely valuable as a cutout. Someone whose expertise made her indispensable and whose position as a foreign national provided additional insulation. Amara heard the shape of it all the way to the end before he finished speaking. She was the cutout. She had been the cutout from the beginning. The external consultant with international credentials. The brilliant black woman with no prior ties to Korean organized crime who could move through legitimate financial channels without triggering the associations that a Korean name might trigger. The wife who could accompany him to legitimate business events and provide a surface of domesticity and stability over an operation that had neither. She had thought she was a partner. She had been architecture. The specific nausea that follows, not physical illness, but the complete structural revision of how you understand your own history, moved through her in a single wave, from the chest outward, and she let it move and she stood straight, and she breathed through it because she did not have the luxury of letting it stop her. "He planned this from the start," she said. "I think he recognized an opportunity when he met you and he built around it. Whether it was planned from the first conversation." Won-sik paused. "I don't know. I don't think it matters." "It doesn't," she agreed. And it didn't. What mattered was where the architecture of her framing had left her, not the timeline of its construction. "There's something else," Won-sik said. She looked at him. "The task force has a contact inside your current—" He stopped, rephrased. "Someone you've been in contact with in the last 48 hours has already reported back to the investigation." The room was very quiet. She thought about the last 48 hours. Dae-jung in the coffee house, Ji-soo in the gallery, Sung-ho at the restaurant. The burner phone, which she had been careful about, but not. She ran the contacts again in her mind with the cold, fast precision of someone who had just discovered the perimeter they believed they controlled was already breached. "Which one?" she said. Won-sik picked up his glasses again. The gesture was not nervous. It was the gesture of a man who found handling objects useful when delivering information he knew would cause damage. "Ji-soo," he said. The sound of that name in that context did something to the interior architecture of Amar's chest that she would not have been able to describe precisely. Not betrayal in the simple sense. She had not been naive about Ji-soo, had not confused their careful friendship with something unconditional, but she had trusted the read. She had looked at another intelligent woman and made an assessment based on 3 years of intermittent contact and a shared frequency of understanding. And she had been wrong. Or Ji-soo had been turned before their meeting. Or Ji-soo had been positioned before their meeting. Or Ji-soo was the task force's contact inside the circles Amara moved in, placed there because someone had anticipated that if Jaemin's arrangement ever fractured, Amara would reach for her. "How do you know this?" Amara said. Her voice had gone very flat. Not emotional flatness, the flatness of a system rerouting around a damaged component, continuing to function through a different pathway. "Because Won-sik has a source inside the task force itself," said a voice from the hallway behind her. She turned. The man standing in the entrance to the hallway was someone she had never seen before. 50s, compact build, wearing a jacket that was not expensive but was correct. The specific correctness of someone who had spent a career wearing clothes that did not draw attention. His face was the face of a man who had made a professional practice of being forgettable, and would have succeeded at it if not for his eyes, which were the eyes of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. "Who are you?" she said. My name is Inspector Beck, he said. I've been running a parallel investigation into the Kang Syndicate for 22 months. Not the Federal Task Force, a separate inquiry operating without their knowledge. Amara looked at Wansik. Wansik had the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely certain was correct and had committed to it anyway because the alternatives were worse. I brought him in 2 days ago, after I saw the transcript. You brought a law enforcement officer into this without telling me, she said. I brought someone who has documentation the task force doesn't have, Wansik said, including documentation about the task force itself. Inspector Beck moved into the room with the measured pace of a man who was used to entering spaces where he was not entirely welcome. He sat down in an armchair without being invited, and he placed a tablet on the coffee table between them, and he brought up a document and he turned the tablet toward her. She looked at it. It took her 11 seconds to understand what she was reading. She knew this because she counted her own heartbeats. The document was an internal communication from within the Federal Task Force. It described a pre-existing agreement with an informant designated by a code reference, and attached to that code reference, in a supplementary file that had been improperly archived and that Beck's inquiry had located during a separate document review, was a name. The informant had not been Jae-min. The informant had been active inside the syndicate for 31 months, which predated Jae-min's cooperation by 17 months. The informant's name was Park Sung-ho. Amara straightened up slowly. The man she had just shared the names of Jae-min's other targeted partners with. The man who had handed her a partial transcript designed to position Jae-min as the primary betrayer. The man who had given her just enough information to redirect her suspicion outward while she handed him the intelligence he needed about who else was moving and what they knew. Sung-ho is theirs, she said. Sung-ho has been theirs for 2.5 years, Beck said. His cooperation with the task force predates Jae-min's. The transcript he showed you was real, but it was selected. The portions about your specific role were included to provoke you into action. They needed to know what you had and how you intended to use it. And Jisoo. Jisoo was recruited 4 months ago. She was given a specific profile to watch for. An educated foreign woman, financial background, connected to the syndicate through a personal relationship. They were anticipating that if Jae-min moved against his wife, she would become a variable that needed to be managed. The room had the specific quality of a space in which several things that had seemed like separate problems had just revealed themselves as a single, much larger problem with no clean edge. Amara sat down, not from weakness, because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness. She had walked into the last 48 hours believing she was building something. She had been walking through a corridor that was narrowing on both sides, the task force on one side, Jae-min on the other, and Sung-ho operating as the mechanism that kept both walls moving inward. Every move she had made had been observed. Every contact she had reached for had been compromised or positioned. The documentation on the drive in Jongno, she had not retrieved it yet, had not used it, had not told anyone about it except Jisoo, who she had told only obliquely, not with specifics. She stopped. She had not told Jisoo about the drive. She had spoken only in general terms about documentation. Jisoo could report that Amara claimed to have records, but she could not tell them what was on the drive or where it was because Amara had not given her those specifics. That was the only thing still inside the perimeter. Inspector Beck, she said, your parallel investigation. What is its mandate? To determine whether the Federal Task Force's agreement with its informants constitutes a deliberate miscarriage of investigative process. He met her gaze without blinking. In simpler terms, to determine whether the task force is protecting certain subjects while sacrificing others, and whether that protection was purchased. Corruption inside the investigation itself. Significant corruption, if my documentation is accurate. Which it is. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them performed anything at each other. What do you need? She said. I need the financial architecture of the syndicate explained by someone who designed it and can distinguish between what was built for legitimate operations and what was built specifically to serve as a sacrifice. He paused. I need a witness who is inside the inner structure and who can demonstrate that the framing currently being built by the task force's informants is deliberately inaccurate. In exchange for what? Immunity documentation through my chain of authority, which operates independently of the task force. and the opportunity to give your account before theirs becomes the official record. Amara thought about the drive in Jongno. She thought about Jisoo in the gallery with her continuously moving eyes. She thought about Sung-ho's large, scarred hands flat on the restaurant table. She thought about the dinner and the black rose and the woman in white, and Jaemin's voice saying our arrangement was never what the public imagined it to be, with the complete calm of a man who had been preparing that sentence for longer than she had understood. She thought about the word architect. She had built things. That was true. She had brought her best mind to the construction of structures that served purposes she had not always examined with full honesty. She had made compromises she had labeled as pragmatism and had not revisited until they compounded into something she could no longer step back from. She was 31 years old, and she was sitting in an apartment full of books in Seodae-moon, and the options available to her had contracted to a single narrow point. And on the other side of that point was something she could not yet see clearly, but that she understood was the only direction left. I need 24 hours, she said. You have 12, Beck said. After 12 hours, the task force moves to the next phase of their operation. Once that phase begins, the immunity window closes. Not because I close it, because the procedural architecture of what they're doing makes it procedurally impossible to intervene. 12 hours. She looked at her hands. Her hands were steady. She noticed this with something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was adjacent to both. The recognition that the part of her that had always known how to function under pressure was still functioning. Even now, even here, even after the last 48 hours had dismantled every assumption she had arrived at them with. There's a safety deposit box, she began, in Jongno. I need to reach it before I can give you anything that constitutes real evidence. What I carry in my memory is valuable, but what I have documented is the difference between a credible account and a case. She met Beck's eyes. If I go to that box and the task force is watching me, they're watching the penthouse, Beck said, and your known contacts. They're not watching you specifically yet because their information from Sung-ho positioned you as someone who was still in the orientation phase, not yet a threat. How long does that assessment hold? Until Sung-ho reports back from the restaurant meeting. He glanced at his watch. He may already have. Amara stood up. Won-sik, she said. I need your car, not yours. Something from your building's parking that isn't registered to you. Won-sik opened his mouth, and then closed it, and then nodded, because he was a man who had survived this long by recognizing when the time for questions had passed. Bayek, she picked up her bag. If I'm not back in 4 hours, the agreement is void. I don't negotiate from custody. He nodded once. 4 hours. She walked toward the door and she was already thinking, not about what had been done to her, not about Jaemin or the dinner or the architecture of her own betrayal. She was thinking about the drive and the route to Jongno and the 12-hour window and what she was going to say when she sat down across from a man with the authority to grant her immunity, and she had to explain, clearly and without flinching, every choice she had made for 3 years and why she had made it. She was going to have to be more honest than she had ever been in her professional life. She was going to have to account for herself, not to Jaemin, not to the partners or the task force, or the men who had built and dismantled her position without her knowledge. She was going to have to account for herself to a legal record that would exist beyond this apartment and this city and this version of her life. And everything that came after would be built on what that account said and how truthfully she said it. She had spent 3 years being useful to someone else's empire. She was about to spend the next 4 hours determining whether she could build something that belonged entirely and irrevocably to herself. The car Won-sik gave her was a gray compact that smelled of old upholstery and someone else's cigarettes, registered to a maintenance contractor whose name appeared nowhere in the syndicate's administrative records. She drove it herself. No Hyun, no driver, no person between her and the road whose loyalty she could not verify with absolute certainty. She took the long route to Jongno. Not because she was afraid of being followed. She had checked the mirrors for 6 consecutive blocks before allowing herself to settle into the drive. But because the long route gave her time to think in the specific way she could only think when her hands were occupied with something mechanical. Driving was useful that way. It engaged enough of her peripheral cognition that the central part could operate without the interference of emotion. She thought about the drive. 3 years of selective documentation. She knew its contents the way you know the contents of something you have returned to repeatedly over time, not with the photographic recall of a single reading, but with the layered familiarity of something that had been revised and reconsidered and added to across hundreds of separate decisions. She knew what was there, and she knew what it could be made to mean in the right hands with the right framing. The problem was that it documented her own participation alongside everything else. She had understood this from the beginning. She had built the archive knowing that any use of it would require her to simultaneously demonstrate two things that existed in tension with each other: that she had participated in these operations, and that her participation had been as a person who understood less than she appeared to understand. The first part was provable by the records themselves. The second part required testimony. Her testimony, delivered clearly and without the kind of defensive trembling that made juries decide that competent people were lying. She had never testified to anything in her life. She pulled the car into a parking structure 2 blocks from the bank in Jongno, and she sat in it for 45 seconds with the engine running, watching the entrance in the rearview mirror. Nothing moved that shouldn't move. She shut the engine off. The bank was ordinary. That was why she had chosen it. A mid-size institution in a part of the city that attracted no particular attention from anyone monitoring the financial movement of organized crime. Because organized crime moved money through institutions that processed significant volume, not through the kind of neighborhood bank that primarily served local small businesses and elderly account holders who had been depositing here since before the building was renovated. She signed in at the safety deposit desk under the name of the Singapore Consulting Entity. The clerk was a young woman who processed the paperwork with the pleasant efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more and found each instance equally unremarkable. The box was the size of a shoebox. She carried it to the private viewing room, and she closed the door, and she sat down at the small table, and she opened it. The drive was there. A small external device in a plastic case that she had purchased in Singapore and handled with the consistent caution of something that had never been connected to any network. Air-gapped from the moment of its creation, never online, never in proximity to a wireless signal while data was being transferred to it. She had built the archive the hard way, physically, in sessions that required her to be alone in a room with a standalone machine, and the carefulness of that process was the only reason it remained unknown. She held it in her hand for a moment. It weighed almost nothing. She put it in her bag. She also removed the only other item in the box, a sealed envelope that she had placed there 6 months ago. In the particular way you do something against the possibility of a contingency you do not fully believe will occur but cannot entirely dismiss. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a handwritten account of a specific conversation she had witnessed 14 months ago. A conversation between Jamin and a man whose name she had not written down on the sheet because writing it would have required her to fully acknowledge what she had seen, and she had not been ready to do that. She was ready now. She put the envelope in her bag with the drive. She closed the empty box and pressed the call button for the clerk, and she waited with her hands flat on the table, breathing evenly, while the door opened and the process of returning the box to its slot was completed with the same pleasant efficiency as everything else in this building. She walked back to the parking structure. She was halfway across the lobby when her phone, the burner, not her regular phone, vibrated in her coat pocket. She stopped walking. She had given the number to 2 people, Bake and Wan Sik. The call was coming from a number that was neither of theirs. She stood in the lobby of the bank between a potted plant that needed water and a poster advertising mortgage rates, and she answered. "Don't go back to Wan Sik's building," said a voice she recognized immediately, with the specific unpleasant sensation of recognizing something you had categorized as safe and were now reclassifying. It was Jisoo. Amara said nothing. "I know what Beck told you about me," Jisoo said. Her voice was tight, not the composed, calibrated voice of their gallery meeting. This was something raw, something operating under duress. "I need you to listen to me for 90 seconds before you hang up. You're calling me on a number you shouldn't have. I got it from your records. I know how that sounds. Give me 90 seconds. Amara looked at the mortgage poster, a family on it, smiling. 60, she said. Jisoo exhaled. What Baek told you is partially accurate. I was approached by the task force 4 months ago. I was asked to watch for a specific profile, which matched you, and I agreed to report back if contact was made. A pause, a short one. What Bake doesn't know, because it isn't in any document he has access to, is that I've been running counter reports for the past 6 weeks. Reports designed to make the task force believe their surveillance of the syndicate's financial network is more comprehensive than it is, so that the people they haven't yet moved against have time to prepare. Why? Because I know what's in the task force's files on me. Her voice dropped. Not from their cooperation, Amara. From when I audited one of their financial partners 18 months ago, and I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and I understood immediately that I was going to be managed rather than protected. I've been managing the management ever since. The lobby was quiet around her. An older man passed, holding a deposit slip, not looking at her. Amara did not move. The task force is moving today, Jisoo said. Not in 12 hours. They moved the timeline up after Sung Ho reported your meeting this morning. They're pulling the trigger while they believe you're still in orientation, before you reach Beck with whatever documentation you have. A beat. If you go back to Won-Six building, they'll take you on entry. They have surveillance on the building since this morning. Amara turned and looked through the bank's glass frontage at the street outside. A gray sedan she had not noticed on the way in was parked at the curb diagonally across from the entrance. 2 people in the front seats, neither of them doing anything in particular, which was itself a thing that people who were doing something in particular often did. "Where is Beck?" Amara said. "I don't know. He may be legitimate, or he may be the task force's mechanism for getting you to voluntarily provide them with your documentation. His independent investigation may be real, or it may be a constructed insertion. I can't verify him." The sedan across the street, not moving, the driver's side window down 2 inches despite the cold. "What are you telling me to do?" Amara said. "I'm telling you that the task force has 2 things they don't know they don't have. They don't know the full extent of what you've documented, and they don't know about a conversation that happened 14 months ago between Jaemin and a specific individual that I have on audio." A silence. "I have audio, Amara. He doesn't know I have it. The task force doesn't know it exists. And what's on it is sufficient to reconstruct the entire informant arrangement from the beginning, including Sung Ho's cooperation, including the deliberate framing of your role. Why do you have audio?" "Because 14 months ago I was brought in to review a transaction, and I was kept waiting in an anteroom for 40 minutes. And I'm a person who makes records of everything as a professional habit. And the wall between the anteroom and the conference room was not as soundproofed as someone should have verified." The tightness in her voice had shifted into something that sounded like the specific exhaustion of a person who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was now deciding whether to set it down. "I've been waiting for the right moment and the right person. I don't think the right moment gets any more right than today." Amara looked at the sedan. She looked at her bag with the drive and the envelope. She looked at the bank clerk behind the desk. Still pleasant, still efficient, completely untouched by any of this. She made a decision. "The coffee house in Mapo where I met Daijong this morning," she said. 1 hour. Come alone and come without your phone. Not off, without. Leave it somewhere and come without it. They'll notice if my phone goes stationary. Then leave it in a taxi heading somewhere convincing. You know how to do this." A beat. "Yes." 1 hour, Amar said, and ended the call. She did not go back to the parking structure. She walked out of the bank through a side exit that opened onto a perpendicular street, and she moved 3 blocks east before flagging a cab. And she sat in the back, and she watched the city through the window, and she let her mind run at full speed without trying to manage the direction. Every piece of the situation was in motion simultaneously, which meant there was no stable position from which to operate. Only a sequence of decisions, each one creating the next, and the only meaningful strategy was to stay ahead of the sequence by making each decision faster than the people tracking her could respond to it. She had the drive. Jisoo had audio. Together they constituted something that no individual piece of this situation, not Baek, not the task force, not Jaemin's cooperation agreement, could account for or neutralize, because neither of them had been anticipated. The question was whether Jisoo was what she said she was. Amara ran the conversation again. Not the content, the texture, the quality of Jisoo's voice under pressure, the specific details she had included and the ones she hadn't. The fact that she had called on the burner number rather than using it as leverage to demonstrate the depth of her access. A person deploying intelligence as a trap would have used that number differently. would have opened with it as a demonstration of power rather than a disclosure of vulnerability. She could be wrong. She knew she could be wrong. She had been wrong about Jisoo once already, or partially wrong, or wrong about the specific nature of what Jisoo was. And wrongness about the same person twice was the kind of mistake that did not offer a third opportunity. But the audio, if real, changed everything. Not incrementally, entirely. She made a second decision, in the back of the cab, in the time it took the driver to navigate a congested intersection in central Seoul. She called Beck's number. He answered in 2 rings. "I need you to verify something," she said, "before our 4-hour window, before anything else. I need you to tell me the name of the individual inside the task force who is your source." A silence. Not long, but present. "That's not information I can disclose." "Then I need you to tell me something else. The parallel investigation you're running, who authorized it? What body? What chain of command?" "Ms. Whitfield, answer the question or this conversation ends and I find another way." Another silence, longer. "The authorization comes through an independent oversight body that reviews investigative conduct. I can provide documentation. I don't need documentation you provide. I need a name I can verify independently." She watched the street. "If your investigation is legitimate, you'll have a supervising authority whose existence I can confirm through a channel you don't control. Give me that name." The silence this time was different from the previous ones. She had become, over 3 years of observing Jae-min manage information and people, finely calibrated to the texture of pauses, which ones were thoughtful and which ones were the silence of a person doing rapid calculation about how much they could afford to give. This one was calculation. "Chief Inspector Park Yeon-hee," he said, "Office of Investigative Standards, Mapo District Authority." She stored the name. 4 hours, she said, and hung up. Masyam. The coffee house in Mapo was quieter at this hour than it had been in the morning. 2 tables occupied. The back corner where Daijung had sat was empty, and she took it, and she ordered water, and she waited with her bag in her lap and her back against the wall. Jisoo arrived in 53 minutes. She came through the door moving like a person who had been walking fast for several blocks, and had forced herself to slow down on the last one. She wore different clothes than the gallery. Darker, less careful, the clothes of someone who had left somewhere quickly. She sat down without greeting, and she placed both hands on the table, palms flat, in the unconscious gesture of someone who needed to feel a solid surface under them. Amara looked at her hands and then at her face. "I need to hear the audio before anything else," Amara said. Jisoo reached into her coat and produced a phone. Not her regular phone, a second device, smaller, older, the kind that predated sophisticated tracking. She placed it on the table and she pressed play. The recording was not clean. There was ambient noise from a ventilation system and the slightly flattened quality of audio recorded through a wall. But the voices were clear enough. Amar had spent 3 years listening to Jaemin's voice in every context and register it was capable of, and she knew it in the same way she knew her own reflection, without effort, without analysis, as a simple fact of continuous exposure. His voice came through the small speaker, and then the other voice, which she did not recognize, lower, more careful, the voice of a man who had professional reasons to be careful about what he said and how he said it. She listened for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it was over, she picked up her water glass and she drank from it, and she set it down, and she sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows the arrival of information so complete and so damning that the mind needs a beat to absorb the full shape of it. The recording contained Jaemin, 14 months ago, an explicit conversation with a senior member of the federal task force. Not as a cooperative informant being managed by investigators. As a co-architect. As a man discussing, with a person who was supposed to be investigating him, the specific sequencing of who would be sacrificed and who would be protected, and the construction of a financial narrative that would place criminal responsibility in the hands of a foreign national consultant whose credentials would make the story credible to any prosecution. The foreign national consultant had no name on the recording. She had a description. The description was Amara. She looked at Jisoo. Jisoo looked back. Her face was pale beneath the deliberate composure, and her hands on the table were not entirely still. A faint tremor in the right one. the kind of tremor that comes not from fear but from sustained adrenaline with nowhere to go. How long have you been carrying this? Amara said. 14 months. Alone. Yes. Amara thought about 14 months of carrying that recording alone. The specific psychological weight of knowing something that could destroy you if it became known that you knew it, and not being able to use it without exposing yourself, and not being able to discard it without losing the only protection you had. She understood the texture of that weight because she had been living inside her own version of it for 48 hours, and it was already the heaviest thing she had ever carried. Jisoo had been carrying something 400 times heavier for 14 months. The man on the recording with Jaemin, Amara said. Do you have a name? Deputy Director Shin Tae-wook. She said it without hesitation. No longer managing the delivery. Just saying the name the way you say something when the weight of it has been stored so long that speaking it is more relief than anything else. He runs the Financial Crimes Division of the task force. He's been running it for 8 years. The informant structure, Sung-ho, the cooperation agreements, the narrative construction, all of it runs through him. Deputy Director Shin Tae-wook. Amara took out the burner phone and she found the contact she had stored for Baek, and she held the phone and she thought for 3 careful seconds. Then she thought about Chief Inspector Park Yeon-hee, Office of Investigative Standards. The name Baek had given her when she pushed him. The name of a supervising authority in an independent oversight body. She thought about what Jisoo had said, that she couldn't verify Baek, that his investigation might be legitimate or might be a mechanism for extracting her documentation. And she thought about the specific way Baek had delivered Park Yeon-hee's name, after calculation, not after consideration. The difference between a person weighing whether to disclose something real and a person deciding how much of a fiction to offer. She put the burner phone back in her bag. I need to make a call, she said, to a number that isn't Baek. She looked at Jisoo. Do you have a contact inside the Investigative Standards Office? Anyone? Not through the task force, not through anyone connected to Shin Tae-wook. Jisoo was quiet for a moment. Then, 1. An attorney I worked with 7 years ago who moved into oversight review. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Call him. Now. Right now. Amara held her gaze. We have a window that is closing. I don't know exactly when Sung-ho reported back this morning, but I know that every hour we sit here is an hour in which the task force is making decisions we can't see. We need to get the audio and the drive into the hands of someone in an independent oversight structure before this afternoon, or Shin Tae-wook closes the case with the narrative he and Jae-min have been building for 14 months, and we spend the next several years trying to fight it from a position of zero credibility. Jisoo picked up the older phone. She dialed from memory, not from a contact list, from memory, which told Amara something important about how Jisoo operated, which was the same way Amara operated, which was with the continuous low-level preparedness of a person who had never fully trusted that their current situation was stable. It rang 4 times. Attorney Yu, Jisoo said. It's Jisoo. I know it's been a long time. I need to know if Park Yeon-hee is still running the Investigative Standards Division. A pause. Her eyes stayed on Amara's face. Yes, I need to know if she's reachable today, directly, not through a scheduling office. Another pause. Longer. Jisoo's jaw tightened fractionally. Since when? A silence. All right. Who replaced her? She lowered the phone. Amara waited. Park Yeon-hee retired 11 months ago, Jisoo said. The name Baek gave you was a real person who no longer has authority over anything. The coffee house was quiet. The 2 occupied tables were doing the ordinary things of people who had no idea what kind of conversation was happening in the back corner. Drinking, checking phones, existing inside lives that did not include this. Amara breathed in through her nose, counted 3 seconds. Out. Baek was the task force's mechanism. He had been in Won-sik's apartment for a reason. And the reason was not an independent parallel investigation. The reason was that Sung-ho had reported her first meeting with Won-sik, and the task force had inserted Baek as a controlled option, an apparent alternative pathway that would lead her to voluntarily hand over everything she had. She had not handed it over. She had come to this coffee house instead, which meant Baek did not yet have the drive or the audio, which meant the task force was currently operating without knowing the full shape of what existed, which meant there was still a window, smaller than 12 hours. She did not know its exact dimensions, but it was open, and what mattered now was not a perfect plan, but the fastest viable one. Ji-soo. Her voice was steady. It surprised her, mildly, that it was. The attorney you just spoke with. Can he get us a direct contact inside investigative standards? The current director, whoever replaced Park Yeon-hee, within the next 2 hours. Jisoo relayed the question into the phone. Listened. He says he can try. He knows the deputy director of the replacement division. He says 45 minutes to an hour. Tell him we need it in 30 minutes. Tell him it's evidence of task force corruption at the deputy director level, and that if we don't reach independent oversight before this afternoon, the evidence will be unsubmittable because the subjects will have moved to seal the case. She paused. Tell him exactly that. Jisoo repeated it verbatim. A silence on the other end of the call that stretched long enough to contain a decision. Then the attorney said something, and Jisoo looked at Amara with the expression of someone who had not fully believed they would get this far. 25 minutes, Jisoo said. He'll call back with a direct contact. 25 minutes. Amara looked at the table. She thought about Jaemin at the restaurant, composed, unhurried, performing the removal of his wife from his life with the smooth efficiency of a man who had managed complex logistics before and found this particular operation unremarkable. She thought about 14 months of construction, about the word architect. She reached into her bag and she placed the external drive on the table between them. Then she reached in again and placed the sealed envelope beside it. When this contact comes through, she said, we go together, not separately, not sequentially. Together, because the audio and the drive together are the case, and separated they're just pieces that can be disputed. Jisoo looked at the drive and the envelope. She placed the older phone, the one with the recording, on the table beside them. They sat across from each other in the back corner of a coffee house in Mapo, with everything they had between them on a table that cost less than Amara's coat, and outside the rain that had started the previous day was still coming down, steady and indifferent. And somewhere in the city, Jae-min Kang was moving through his day with the confidence of a man who had already won. Amara's phone vibrated. The burner. Beck's number. She looked at it. It vibrated again. She turned it face down on the table and she left it there, and she watched the front door of the coffee house, waiting for Jisoo's attorney to call back. Because the task force's mechanism could ring as many times as it needed to, and she was done, being managed. The callback came in 19 minutes. Jisoo answered on the first ring, and she listened for 40 seconds without speaking. And then she wrote something on a napkin and pushed it across the table to Amara. A name and a direct office number and a building address in Yoido that Amara recognized as a government annex building she had passed 100 times without ever having a reason to enter. Deputy Director Kwon Mi-rai, Office of Investigative Conduct Review. Amara looked at the name. She looked at Jisoo. Your attorney, she said. Is he clean? He's been in private practice for 6 years. No government contracts, no connections to the task force structure. Jisoo folded the napkin in half. He's also the person who helped me set up my firm's independent compliance protocols, which means he has his own reasons to want investigative corruption documented rather than buried. Amara stood up. She put the drive in her interior coat pocket, against her body. She put the envelope in the same pocket. Jisoo picked up the older phone and held it with both hands like something irreplaceable, which it was. We go now, Amara said. They left the coffee house and walked into the rain. Deputy Director Kwon Mi-rai was a woman in her late 40s who looked like she had been in the middle of something when they arrived and had not stopped being in the middle of it simply because 2 unscheduled visitors had appeared in her outer office. She came to the doorway herself rather than sending her assistant, which told Amara something. She looked at them both with the fast, comprehensive assessment of someone whose professional function was identifying what people were not saying, and she said, 15 minutes, come in. The office was government functional, no ornamentation beyond what was structurally necessary, documents in organized stacks, 2 monitors angled for parallel use, a window overlooking the annex courtyard where the rain was collecting in shallow pools on the paving stones. Kwon sat down. She did not offer them chairs, but neither of them had expected her to. They stood. My attorney called you, Jisoo said. It was not a question. He gave me a preliminary description. I want to hear it directly from you. She looked at Amara. Which one of you is the financial consultant? I am, Amara said. And you were inside the Kang Syndicate's operational structure for 3 years. Yes. As a participant or a contractor? Amara held her gaze. The task force's version will tell you, architect. The accurate version is considerably more complicated than that, and the documentation I have is what demonstrates the difference. She reached into her coat and placed the external drive on the desk between them. This is 3 years of selective records. Meeting documentation, financial flow summaries, copies of private arrangements that were deliberately kept off formal record to serve a specific restructuring purpose. She paused. And this. She placed the envelope beside the drive. A contemporaneous written account of a conversation I witnessed 14 months ago between Jae-min Kang and a senior member of the task force currently investigating his organization. Bombs. Kwon looked at the items on her desk without touching them. Then she looked at Jisoo. The attorney mentioned audio, she said. Jisoo placed the older phone on the desk beside the drive and the envelope. The audio of that same conversation, recorded without the knowledge of either party, by a person in an adjacent space. She met Kwon's eyes. It names the task force member directly. It describes the informant structure, the sacrificial framing, and the deliberate construction of a narrative positioning a third party as the primary criminal architect. It is 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and it is unambiguous. Kwon was still for a moment, not the stillness of uncertainty, the stillness of a person who has just understood the size of what has been placed in front of them and is running the procedural implications at speed. The name, Kwon said. Deputy Director Shin Tae-wook, Amara said. The rain outside was steady. A phone rang somewhere in the outer office and was answered immediately and stopped. Kwon reached forward and picked up the older phone. She looked at Jisoo. You consent to this recording being used in an official review proceeding? Yes. And you? She looked at Amara. The drive and the written account. Yes. Under the condition that my cooperation and the accurate account of my role within the syndicate structure are documented as part of the submission record, and that any prosecutorial action taken using this evidence includes a formal assessment of the framing narrative that has been constructed about me through the task force's existing informant agreements. Kwon looked at her for a long moment. You're asking for the record to show that the case being built against you is a fabrication. I'm asking for the record to show what the evidence actually demonstrates, which is that the case being built against me was designed by the same person I am now submitting evidence against. Yes. Another moment. Kwon set the phone down. I'll need formal statements from both of you, today. This office, on the record, with a reviewing officer present. She looked between them. Once you submit these materials and your statements, this office has an obligation to act. I want you to understand what that means. Shin Tae-wook will know, Kang Jae-min will know, and the task force structure will know that this office has received this evidence within hours of us beginning the formal review process. The protection this office can offer you is procedural, not physical. Amara heard the subtext of that clearly. She was being told that what happened next would be loud and fast, and that being inside a government proceeding was not the same as being safe. I understand, she said. So do I, Jisoo said. Kwon picked up her desk phone. She spoke to someone in the outer office in 3 clipped sentences. She set it down. My officer will take your preliminary statements in the conference room. I'm going to make 2 calls before I join you. I need you to stay in this building until I do. She looked at Amara with the direct appraisal of someone who had spent a career reading people who were performing composure under pressure and had become expert at distinguishing the performance from the actual architecture beneath it. Is there anything else in your possession or knowledge that is not on that drive? Amara thought about the account she was going to have to give. The full one. Everything she had done and everything she had understood and the precise location of the line between those 2 things. Yes, she said, but it takes longer than this room allows. Kwon nodded. Conference room, now, The statements took 4 hours. Not the 15 minutes Kwon had offered at the door. That window had closed the moment she listened to the first 90 seconds of the audio on the older phone, and her expression had shifted in the specific way of a person hearing something that reorganizes their understanding of a situation they thought they already understood. Amara spoke for most of it, not in the continuous flowing account of someone who had rehearsed, in the stop-start, doubled back, revised and clarified account of someone who was trying to be accurate rather than persuasive, which was a harder and more exhausting thing to do. The reviewing officer, a compact man in his 40s named Inspector Ha, asked precise questions and wrote precise notes, and never indicated by his expression whether what he was hearing aligned with or contradicted anything he already knew, which was either professional discipline or genuine neutrality, and she did not particularly care which. She talked about the beginning, the consulting engagement and the moment she understood what she was actually being asked to do, and the decision she had made to stay. She did not soften that. She did not frame it as something that had happened to her. She said she had made a choice, and that the choice had been made with incomplete information but not with zero information, and that the incomplete part did not erase the knowing part. She talked about the work she had done, the structures she had built, the specific operations she had participated in, and the ones she had been adjacent to without direct involvement, and how she understood the difference between those categories and how a prosecutor might or might not honor that difference. She talked about the 14 months, about the instruments she had helped Jaimin construct without understanding that they were being built not as operational tools, but as evidence, curated and shaped to tell a specific story about specific people, and that she had been the most useful component of that construction because her external credentials and her genuine skill made the story credible in ways that it would not otherwise be. At 2 points, she stopped and asked for water and drank it without tasting it and continued. At one point, Inspector Ha asked her, in the measured way of someone asking a question they already know the answer to, whether she had loved Jaimin Kang. She sat with the question for longer than she intended to. "I don't think I can answer that usefully," she said finally. "What I had with him was real, in the sense that it occupied a real amount of space in my life and required real investment from me. Whether it qualifies as what most people mean by that word is something I'm going to be thinking about for a long time." "What is it?" She looked at the table. "What I know is that I trusted him, which in retrospect is the more relevant fact. I trusted his version of events and his stated purposes and his account of what I was to him. And he used that trust with more precision and more premeditation than I understood until 2 days ago." Ha wrote something. He did not offer a response. Jisoo gave her statement separately, in a different room, and when they were both finished and returned to the hallway, they stood outside the conference room doors and neither of them spoke for a moment, the way people don't speak after they've said everything there is to say about something. "How do you feel?" Jisoo asked. Amara considered the question honestly. "Empty," she said. "In the specific way you feel empty after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally set it down. Not relieved yet, just empty." Jisoo nodded. She looked like she understood that precisely. Kwon found them in his hallway at 6:47 in the evening. She walked toward them with the particular pace of a person whose afternoon had been significantly more complicated than their morning, and who had made their peace with that. She stopped a few feet away and she looked at them both and she said, "Shin Tae-wook has been suspended pending formal review as of 1 hour ago. The task force's active operations have been placed under independent oversight hold, which means any pending arrests or case closures are frozen until the review is complete." Amara absorbed this. "Jaimin Kang," she said. "His cooperation agreement is suspended pending the review of whether that agreement was structured through a compromised authority." Kwon paused. "Which means he does not currently have the protections he believed he had this morning." Sung Ho. "His informant status is under the same review hold. He was brought in for questioning 2 hours ago." She looked at Amara directly. "The narrative that was being constructed around your role in the syndicate's financial operations is now the subject of the review itself, rather than the basis of a prosecution. That is the best outcome this office can offer you today. What happens after the review is completed depends on what the review finds and what independent prosecution decisions are made on the basis of the full evidence record, including everything on the drive. Which will be examined in full context and not through the frame that the task force had been applying to it." She held Amara's gaze. "I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you're cleared. I'm saying the playing field has been reset. What happens on it from here is a process. And the process takes time, and I can't tell you what it concludes. Amara nodded. I know. Kwan turned to leave and then stopped. She turned back once, which seemed to require a small decision. The original agreement that defined your role inside the Kang Syndicate, she said. The one you described in your statement. The terms that positioned you as a contractual partner rather than an employee or a subordinate. She paused. Those terms, as you've described them, also establish a degree of autonomous standing that cuts against the framing of you as a directed participant. I want you to have an attorney review your statement before any formal prosecutorial contact is made. She left without waiting for a response. Amara stood in the hallway and she let that land. All of it. The suspension, the hold, the reset, the attorney, the process that took time and could not be predicted. She let it land without trying to make it mean more than it meant, which was the discipline of someone who had spent 3 years inside a world where the difference between what something appeared to mean and what it actually meant had real consequences. It was not over. It was not a victory. It was the moment when the battle stopped being invisible and became official. And official was better than invisible, but it was not the same as finished. She looked at Jisoo. Come on, Jisoo said. I know somewhere that serves food that isn't from a menu. 3 months later, Seoul had the particular quality it always had in early spring. Not warm yet, not exactly, but the cold had lost its conviction, and the light in the mornings came at a different angle and stayed a different amount of time, and the city moved through it without comment because Seoul did not mark seasonal transitions any more than it marked anything else. Amara had a small office in Mappo. Not the penthouse, not the Gangnam headquarters with its shared space and its syndicate infrastructure, a rented floor in a building that housed an accounting firm on 2 levels and a translation service on the 3rd, and a handful of independent consultants on the 4th, where she had taken 3 connected rooms and furnished them with the specific restraint of someone who had learned not to build around someone else's permanence. She was there early most mornings. She liked the building before it fully filled, the clean sound of her own footsteps, the coffee she made herself, the view from the 4th floor window that showed a residential street rather than a skyline, which she found easier to think against. The review had concluded 6 weeks earlier. The formal findings had taken 17 pages, which she had read in full 3 times, and which she could now summarize in a single sentence if required to. The financial architecture attributed to her in the task force's original case had been deliberately mischaracterized in scope and authority by informants operating under a compromised agreement, and the prosecutorial narrative built around that mischaracterization did not reflect the evidentiary record. It was not an exoneration document. It was a findings document, and findings were different from clearance, and she had learned during the review process to be precise about that difference rather than collapsing it for the sake of emotional convenience. She was not cleared. She was accurately characterized, which meant that what she had done and what she had understood at the time she did it were now part of the official record in the form she had given them rather than the form Jae Min and Shin Tae-wook had constructed. Shin Tae-wook had been formally charged. That process was ongoing and would be for some time. Jae-min Kang had lost his cooperation agreement, and with it the insulation that had been the actual purpose of the agreement. His organization had been subjected to a restructured investigation through a newly constituted task force operating under Kwon Mi-ra's oversight authority. Sung-ho, stripped of his informant status and the protections it had provided, had found himself facing the same exposure he had been helping to engineer for others. The Jeju subsidiary had been frozen as part of the organizational review. The Eastern Port contracts were the subject of a civil proceeding brought by the partners who had been in the process of being quietly eliminated. None of it was fast. None of it was clean. The law did not move the way narrative moved. It moved the way water moved through rock, which was slowly and without the satisfaction of visible progress at any given moment, and you had to take the long view to see that anything was happening at all. She had developed over the past 3 months a tolerance for the long view that she had not previously possessed. Dae-jung came to her office one morning in March. He called ahead, which she appreciated because it meant he understood that the terms of contact between them had changed. and that showing up unannounced at a door she controlled was not something she would receive the same way she might have received it when she was operating inside his world rather than adjacent to it. He sat across from her desk, and he looked older than he had in the coffee house in February. Not dramatically. The way people look older when something they have been managing for a long time has finally been allowed to stop being managed. "The civil case is moving," he said. "The partners are expecting testimony from you." "I know, my attorney is coordinating with the filing." "It's going to be difficult for you, on the stand." "I understand that." He looked at his hands on his knees. "You didn't have to include the original agreement documentation in what you submitted to Kwan's office. The agreements that formalize the partner structure, including mine. You could have limited what you gave them." "I know," she said. "You gave them everything." "Yes." He looked up. His expression was the expression of a man trying to understand a decision he could not have made himself and was not sure how to feel about the fact that someone else had. "Why?" Amara looked at him for a moment, at the scarred hands and the tired face and the gray suit that was the same kind of gray suit he always wore, as if his wardrobe were the one stable element in a world that had spent the last several months reorganizing itself without his input. "Because the only thing I had to offer that was actually worth anything was an accurate account," she said. "Not a strategic one. Not a version curated to protect the people I needed to cooperate with and damage the ones I didn't. A complete account." She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and set it down. "I've spent 3 years being useful to someone else's version of events. I was done with that." Daijung was quiet for a long time. "The partners are talking about reconstituting the commercial arrangement," he said finally. "Legitimately. The infrastructure still exists, the port connections, the logistics framework. Without the criminal overlay, it's actually a functional business." He paused. "There's a suggestion that someone with financial architecture experience and no existing position in any of the existing entities might be an appropriate structure lead." Amara said nothing. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he said. "Good," she said, "because I don't have one today." He nodded and stood, and he said something about her attorney coordinating with his attorney about the civil testimony, and she confirmed that yes, that was happening, and then he left. She sat at her desk for a few minutes after he left, and she thought about the word architecture, which had followed her from the task force's case documents into her own thinking about her professional future, the way certain words do when they have been applied to you forcefully enough that they leave a mark regardless of the context in which they were applied. She was good at building structures. That was true. She had always been good at it. The skill itself was not contaminated by the uses it had been put to, and she was done performing discomfort with her own intelligence because it had been exploited by someone else. She pulled open a drawer and took out a legal pad and a pen, and she wrote, at the top of a fresh page, "Conditions." And then she stopped and looked at the word, and she felt, for the first time in several months, the specific satisfaction of beginning something rather than surviving something. She saw Jae-min once, in April. Not arranged, not sought. She was leaving a meeting in Gangnam, walking to a taxi stand on a Tuesday afternoon when the cherry trees along the boulevard were doing what they did in April, blooming in that excessive, all-at-once way that seemed disproportionate and was somehow exactly proportionate. And he came out of a building ahead of her on the pavement. He had 2 attorneys with him, or people performing the function of attorneys, and he was in the middle of a sentence when he looked up and saw her. He stopped talking. The attorneys continued for 2 steps and then stopped also, the way people stop when the person they are accompanying has stopped without explanation. Amara kept walking. Not to avoid him. She had not decided to approach him or to avoid him. She was simply walking toward the taxi stand, and he happened to be between her and it, and she was not going to alter her route. She was close enough to see his face clearly by the time it would have been reasonable to acknowledge him. And she looked at it the way you look at something you once organized your life around and are now seeing from a sufficient distance to perceive its actual scale. He looked like himself, composed, precise, dressed well, managing the situation of her unexpected presence with the controlled neutrality of a man who had considerable practice at managing unexpected situations. But there was something around the eyes that had not been there at the restaurant dinner in February. A specific quality of sustained strain, the look of someone who had been working very hard to maintain a surface and was finding the work costlier than anticipated. He said her name, not loudly, almost quietly, like a man testing whether a word he used to use often still worked the same way. She stopped. The attorneys looked between them with the practiced non-expression of professionals in the presence of something personal. Amara, he said again. Jamin, she said. Just his name. Nothing added to it. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him trying to locate the version of her that he had built his assessment on. The woman who had organized herself around his world, who had absorbed his decisions and filtered them through her own intelligence and offered him the results of that process as though they were natural and inevitable rather than the product of 3 years of continuous labor. That woman was not here. She was standing in front of him on a pavement in April under cherry trees that were doing something excessive with the light. And she was a different configuration of the same person, and the difference was not subtle. He seemed to understand this, in the particular way that intelligent people understand things they would rather not understand. The review findings, he said. Yes. Your attorney is filing additional documentation. Yes. It's going to complicate the reconstituted investigation. That's what accurate documentation does sometimes. He looked at her, and something crossed his face that she had not expected and could not immediately name, and then she could... It was something close to the expression of a person who has arrived at an accounting of their own choices and found the math honest and unwelcome. I thought I was protecting myself, he said, from variables I couldn't control. She held his gaze. I know. I wasn't wrong about what you were capable of. No, she said. You were wrong about whose side those capabilities would end up on. He had nothing to say to that, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him for one more moment, at the face she had looked at for 3 years from close range, from across rooms, from the particular intimate distance of a shared life that had turned out to be constructed rather than grown. And then she looked at the cherry trees and the pavement and the taxi stand at the end of the block. Goodbye, Jamin, she said. She walked past him. He did not call after her. Again, the office in Mapo filled slowly, the way things fill when they're built around use rather than appearance. A second desk appeared in the 3rd week of March, occupied by a young analyst named Su Min, who had answered an advertisement that described the position with an accuracy that had apparently surprised people accustomed to job postings that optimized for enthusiasm rather than precision. A filing system that actually reflected how Amara thought, rather than how the Kang Syndicate's administrative conventions dictated information should flow. A plant on the windowsill that she watered every 3 days and that had, against some internal expectation she hadn't examined, survived the winter. Jisoo came for coffee on Thursdays when both of them could manage it. They did not talk about the review or the task force or the proceedings. They talked about the city, about work, about the particular texture of building something from a position of zero institutional support, something Jisoo had been doing alone for years, and that Amara was doing for the first time, and finding both harder and more satisfying than anything she had been part of before. She did not think about the Black Rose from the restaurant dinner very often. When she did, it was briefly and with the detached interest of someone examining an artifact from an archaeological site, something that told you about conditions that no longer obtained, useful as context rather than as anything still relevant. The legal pad with conditions at the top had 11 pages of writing in it by April. Not a plan exactly, more the preliminary architecture of one, the kind of structural thinking that precedes actual construction, when you are still learning the shape of the ground you're building on. She was learning the shape of her own ground. That was the work of this particular season. Not the dramatic work, not the drive and the envelope and the 4 minutes of audio and the coffee house in Mapo and the conference room and the statement that had taken 4 hours and the walk out of the government annex into rain that had been falling since February. That work was done. It had been the necessary work, the survival work, and she had done it, and she was on the other side of it, and she was not pretending the other side felt uncomplicated. It felt like a construction site, like the phase between demolition and building, when there is rubble that hasn't been fully cleared and the new structure exists only in the architectural drawings, and the gap between those two states is where you have to live while the work is in progress. She had learned, in the past several months, to live in that gap without filling it prematurely with something that looked like resolution but wasn't. On a Thursday in late April, she arrived at the office early enough that the building was still quiet, and the fourth floor had the particular morning quality she had come to rely on. And she made coffee and stood at the window and looked at the residential street below, where a woman was walking a small dog that kept stopping to investigate things that were invisible to everyone but itself. And the cherry trees on the far side of the street were past their peak now, dropping petals that the morning air moved in slow circles toward the pavement. She put both hands around the coffee cup and let the warmth reach her palms. She thought about the legal pad and the 11 pages and the question of what came next, and she felt the thing she felt on the mornings when the work of it settled into something manageable. Not peace exactly, not the uncomplicated kind, but the functional peace of a person who knows what they're doing and why they're doing it and has stopped requiring those two things to feel more certain than they actually are. The dog on the street below found whatever it had been investigating and lost interest in it and moved on. She watched it go. Then she turned from the window and sat down at her desk and opened the legal pad to page 12 and began.